I stood at the curb, stunned as the wind tugged the sleeve of my cardigan from a black trash bag, pastel green, hand-stitched, tossed like garbage. My daughter stood on the porch, coffee in hand, her voice sharp and casual. Old people don't deserve nice things. Not mom, not mother, just old. After raising her alone, after putting her first for 7 decades, I wasn't her mother anymore. I was waste. And that's when I knew some things get thrown out, others get sold. Wait, before we go any further, I got to ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Helen Wright's morning routine was rarely disrupted. She rose with the light, fed her tabby cat, Pearl, brewed a single cup of hazelnut coffee, and walked down the narrow brick path of her Charleston townhouse to retrieve the paper. It was a rhythm she'd built over years, clean, reliable, and hers. But today, something in the air was off. Halfway down the driveway, her steps slowed. Sitting at the curb were 3 oversized black trash bags. New, knotted tight, but oddly shaped. One of the bags had shifted, its top slightly gaping from the wind. She noticed a sleeve spilling out. At first, she thought it was an old towel, or maybe a blanket, but then the light caught the pearlescent buttons. Her breath caught in her chest. She knelt slowly, joints stiff from age, but not yet untrustworthy. Her fingers tugged the bag open an inch wider. Inside were clothes, not just any clothes, but hers. The pale blue blouse with the hand-sewn collar, her black wool coat, the Sunday skirts she'd hung in cedar for years, even the pastel green cardigan she'd knitted herself last spring. Each stitch placed with purpose. Helen blinked, but the vision didn't change. It was all real, folded neatly, bagged like waste. A familiar voice drifted from behind her, sharp, amused, and full of judgment. "I told Tyler to take that out before you saw it," Melissa said. But of course, he forgot. As usual, Helen straightened slowly, the cardigan still in her hand. She turned to face her daughter standing at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, a sleek white coffee cup in one hand, the other rested on her hip, her manicured nails flashing in the sunlight. She was dressed in soft beige linen and gold accessories, expensive, performative, and cold. Helen didn't speak right away. Melissa let out a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Honestly, you should thank me. Half that stuff was decades old. You look like you stepped out of a time capsule. It's not appropriate anymore." "Appropriate for what?" Helen asked softly. Melissa tilted her head, patronizing. "For someone your age. You're 71. Mom, you've lived your life. It's time to start dressing like it." From the doorway, Tyler stood silently, one hand braced on, the doorframe, eyes down. His tie was half loose, as if he'd started taking it off and then forgot why. He didn't speak. He never did when it mattered. A shadow moved quickly beside him, and Sophie came down the porch steps barefoot and tense. "Grandma," she said, reaching Helen's side. "Don't worry, I'll get them back. We'll take them inside." "No." Helen's voice was quiet but solid. Sophie looked up at her in confusion, but Helen only shook her head. "She just made her down payment," Helen said, eyes still locked on Melissa. Melissa blinked. "What?" "Nothing," Helen replied. "Leave it." With calm hands, she folded the sleeve of the cardigan back inside the bag and tied the knot tighter. Her face revealed no anger, no tears, just a kind of slow-burning clarity. Melissa turned with a scoff and disappeared inside. Tyler followed, pausing only long enough to glance back with what might have been guilt, but not enough to speak. That night, Helen sat on a white wicker chair on Arlene Brooks's wraparound porch, the late summer breeze stirring the wisteria vines that framed the edge of the railing. Crickets chirped in the bushes below, and in the distance, the faint sound of music from a neighbor's backyard drifted through the evening air. Arlene poured sweet tea into mismatched glasses, setting one gently in front of Helen. She threw them out just like that, Arlene asked, her brows pulled together. Helen nodded, watching a moth flutter near the porch light. Didn't even blink, she said. I embarrassed her. Arlene leaned back with a slow exhale, shaking her head. She thinks getting older makes you invisible, weak. Helen's gaze stayed fixed on the edge of the porch. She thinks she's won something, like getting rid of my clothes somehow erases who I am. She's wrong, Arlene said, her voice tightening. And if you ask me, it's time you reminded her just how wrong she is. There was a long pause. The air was thick with late summer humidity, and yet a chill ran down Helen's spine. Not from fear, but recognition. Maybe it is, Helen murmured. Arlene leaned forward, her expression sharpening like a blade. You know what I always say. When they forget your value, you don't argue, you show them. Helen finally looked at her, eyes steady. Let's show her. 2 days after the close incident, Helen stood in the back room of her townhouse with the door closed and locked, the curtains drawn against the morning light. Her sewing cabinet, once the heart of her work as a seamstress, hadn't been touched in months. She moved the chair aside and shifted the cabinet a few inches forward, revealing the wall safe tucked behind it. The combination was still etched into her mind, muscle memory guiding her fingers across the dial. With a soft, metallic click, the safe opened. Inside, tucked neatly beneath her own documents and a few heirloom keepsakes, sat the case. Midnight. Blue velvet, brass hinges. Melissa had handed it off years ago during a remodel and never asked for it back. At the time, it had seemed casual, an afterthought. Hold on to this, would you? Somewhere safe. Helen remembered the words, but more importantly, she remembered the tone, like she was a storage locker, not a person. She lifted the case and placed it carefully on the table beneath the window. The latch gave easily. Inside, a dozen pieces lay cushioned in silk, necklaces with heavy gold links, earrings with dark sapphires, a tennis bracelet that sparkled as though it had never known a moment of neglect. Helen didn't wear jewelry like this. It was too loud, too flashy, but she had an eye for craftsmanship, and she could tell these were not cheap. She retrieved the file folder she'd kept in her cabinet. Inside were appraisals Melissa had given her to hold with the set, each dated and notarized. Some were over 10 years old, but the documents were intact, showing itemized valuations with Melissa's name nowhere on them. Instead, they were addressed to Helen herself. She flipped through them slowly, letting the numbers settle into her mind. A knock came from behind her. Helen startled, closing the case and file in one fluid motion. She stepped quickly to the door and cracked it open. It was Sophie. Her granddaughter's eyes fell on the velvet case, still sitting on the table behind her. I didn't mean to startle you, Sophie said. Just checking in. Helen hesitated. She didn't want Sophie pulled into this, but she also wasn't about to lie. I was just confirming something, Helen said, keeping her voice light. Sophie stepped in and closed the door behind her, her arms folded. I heard Mom on the phone last night. She was laughing with her friend about how her diamonds are worth more than your entire life. Her words, not mine. Helen's stomach turned, but she didn't flinch. Sophie walked over to the table and looked down at the closed case. Are those hers? No, Helen said quietly. They're mine now. She left them here years ago. All the paperwork is in my name. She never asked for them back, never cared until now. Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but paused, thinking, what are you going to do? Helen opened the case again, watching the way Sophie's eyes widened slightly at the glimmering pieces. I'm going to test the market, Helen said, almost to herself. If her diamonds are so valuable, let's find out how valuable. Later that afternoon, Arlene met her in the quiet back room of an upscale consignment auction house downtown. The place was clean, elegant, discreet, the kind of place where private wealth quietly changed hands. The manager, a woman in her 50s, with tortoise-shell glasses and keen eyes, examined each piece with the precision of a jeweler and the curiosity of a storyteller. She asked no questions Helen couldn't answer. When they finished, she looked up from her notes and smiled faintly. "These pieces will draw serious interest," she said, "particularly before the holiday season. Are you interested in full auction or a selective release?" Helen smiled politely. "Auction all of it." Arlene, sitting beside her, leaned over and whispered with satisfaction, "The auction house is going to love this collection." That evening, Helen stopped by David Klein's law office. It was late, the sun setting behind the oak trees lining the courthouse green. His office smelled like paper and furniture polish, unchanged in 20 years. He glanced through the documents she handed him, nodding slowly. "You have possession," he said, "and you've had it for years. The appraisals are in your name. Unless she files a civil claim and proves otherwise, which won't be easy. You're within your rights, especially if she never filed an intent to reclaim." Helen nodded. David leaned back in his chair. "Just know this could stir trouble. Are you ready for that?" Helen didn't blink. "She threw away what mattered to me. I'm just returning the favor." The back room at the auction house smelled faintly of polished wood and aged velvet, a quiet, expensive kind of air. Helen sat on a high-backed chair near a long glass table, the velvet jewelry case open in front of her. Across from her, Sophie held a high-resolution camera with careful, steady hands, adjusting the lens as the late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows behind them. "Okay," Sophie murmured, gently angling the necklace so the light caught the cut of the diamond. "Just like that. Perfect." Helen watched her granddaughter work with quiet admiration. There was a calm, almost clinical precision to Sophie's movements. But underneath it, Helen could feel a current of fierce loyalty, the kind that came from being quietly disappointed one too many times and finally choosing a side. One by one, the pieces were laid out on a slate-gray backdrop, each given its own moment to shine. The sapphire drop earrings, the heavy gold bracelet, a brooch shaped like a flower, petals tipped in tiny pearls. "I still don't get why she gave you all this and forgot about it," Sophie said, not looking up from the camera. "It's not like Mom ever forgets anything expensive." "She didn't forget," Helen said softly. "She just assumed I'd always be here holding. Things she didn't want to think about, like storage without rent." Sophie paused, meeting Helen's gaze for a moment, then nodded once and went back to photographing. When they finished, a young associate from the auction house came in with white cotton gloves and carefully collected each item, placing them into lined trays and sealing them with tamper-proof tags. A clipboard with catalog descriptions followed, along with a scheduled consignment agreement. "Your pieces will be featured in our annual winter prestige auction," the associate explained, eyes scanning the form. "The date is set for December 19th. That's one of our biggest draws of the year." Helen signed the papers without hesitation. The pen glided smoothly across the cream-colored page. "Holiday desperation always makes people bid higher," Arlene whispered, with a gleam in her eye. She'd arrived halfway through the session and now leaned casually against the back wall, arms folded. Best revenge is Hammerfall, watching people fight over what she doesn't even know she lost. Helen smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Not yet. That night after dinner, she sat at her kitchen table while Sophie scrolled silently through her phone. Across the screen flashed a new video Melissa had posted. In it, Melissa was pouting dramatically at the camera, her fingers twirling a chunky gold bracelet around her wrist, gaudy, shiny, and just slightly off color. "This," Melissa announced to her followers, "is the look of a woman who knows her worth. And her jewelry." Sophie rolled her eyes and tilted the phone so Helen could see. "She thinks those fakes are still the real ones," Sophie muttered. Helen didn't even glance at the screen. "Let her show off. The real ones are out for bids." A beat of silence passed before Sophie burst out laughing, quiet at first, then unable to stop. Helen let out a soft chuckle too, the sound dry and brief. Across the table, the consignment receipt sat neatly folded beside a steaming mug of mint tea. The total estimated auction value based on preliminary interest had been listed in a discrete line near the bottom, $275,000 to $340,000. The number didn't thrill Helen. It wasn't about the money. It was about the mirror and what Melissa would see when the truth finally hit her. At 11:07 that night, Helen received an email notification, Prestige Winter Auction Confirmation and Lot ID Assignment. She clicked it open and scanned the list. Each item had a catalog ID, a photo thumbnail, and a confirmed auction number. There they were, Melissa's glittering trophies, now officially divorced from her vanity, ready to become someone else's possession. Helen closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. The air was still, her cat curled quietly on the windowsill. Outside, a fog had begun to creep in from the harbor, softening the edges of the neighborhood's pastel-painted homes and casting a silver sheen across the empty street. Dinner at Melissa's house was a curated performance. The lighting was soft and expensive, the wine pre-decanted, and the table set with brushed gold cutlery Melissa had insisted came from a boutique in the Hamptons. But tonight, something in the air buzzed with static, something unspoken and sharp. Tyler passed the roasted asparagus without speaking. His eyes were glassy from his second bourbon. Across from him, Sophie picked at her food, earbuds in one ear, half listening to music, half watching the room like a cat waiting for thunder. Helen, seated at the far end of the table, ate in quiet, unrushed bites. Her cardigan was soft gray cashmere, one Melissa hadn't seen in years. Melissa barely touched her plate. She was too distracted, her eyes darting every few minutes toward the hallway beyond the dining room. "Tyler," she said abruptly, her voice slicing through the low hum of dinner. "Did you move my jewelry case?" Tyler blinked. "What?" "My blue velvet one." From my dresser, Melissa stood up without waiting for an answer. "I wanted to swap out my earrings before Sophie dragged everyone to dessert." Sophie didn't look up. "Nobody wants dessert." But Melissa was already gone, her footsteps clipped and fast down the hardwood hallway. Helen folded her napkin slowly, her gaze fixed on her water glass. A few seconds passed, then a high-pitched shriek tore through the house like shattering glass. Sophie pulled her earbuds out, startled. Tyler stiffened, the color draining from his face. Helen didn't move. "Tyler." Melissa's voice was full of rage and rising panic. "Where the hell are they?" He pushed back from the table, guilt sloshing in his glass. "What's going on?" Melissa stormed back into the dining room, the empty jewelry case gripped in both hands like an accusation. Her face was twisted with fury, the faint sheen of sweat glistening across her brow. She held it up like it was Exhibit A in a murder trial. "It's empty. Everything is gone." Tyler looked confused and then vaguely afraid. I didn't touch it." Melissa turned to Sophie next, eyes narrowed. "Did you go in my room? You've been sneaking around lately? Is this some kind of sick rebellion?" Sophie stood, arms crossed. "Don't look at me. I haven't stepped foot in your closet since I turned 14 and realized everything in there is fake. You spoiled little brat." Melissa started, her voice cracking. "Don't you get it? My real jewelry is gone. The sapphires, the gold bracelet, the tennis necklace, gone. Vanished." Then her eyes locked on Helen. There was a moment, just a blink, where the room seemed to pause. Even the air felt thicker. "You," Melissa said, pointing the empty case toward her mother like a weapon. "You did this." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? You've been bitter ever since I tossed out your closet full of vintage junk." "Don't call it junk," Sophie said sharply. Melissa ignored her, stepping closer to Helen. "Now you've been sitting. They're smug as hell all night like you know something." Helen met her eyes calmly. "You threw my clothes in the trash without a second thought. Maybe your jewelry followed." Melissa stared. mouth open as though the words had short-circuited her brain. "What does that even mean?" she barked. "Are you confessing? Did you sell it? Pawn it? Where is it?" Tyler put a hand on her arm. "Melissa, calm down. Don't touch me," she shouted, jerking away. "You're useless." Her voice had risen to a manic pitch now, echoing off the marble countertops and open floor plan she'd always been so proud of. Her face was flushed, her lipstick smudged at the corner of her mouth, her hands clenched around the empty velvet box, knuckles white. Sophie, without a word, slipped her phone out of her hoodie pocket and tapped record. She didn't say anything, just held the phone low, letting it capture the storm unraveling in front of them. Helen stood slowly, collected her purse from the back of her chair, and placed her napkin gently on her plate. She gave Sophie a knowing glance, then turned to Melissa with measured calm. "If you can't keep track of what's real and what's not," Helen said, "maybe you shouldn't own either." Melissa screamed, not a word, just pure, frustrated rage, as Helen walked past her and out the front door without looking back. The auction house was lit like a cathedral, polished oak, brass chandeliers, and hushed voices echoing across marble floors. Even the air carried a certain reverence, like the walls understood the value of what passed through them. Outside, Charleston's December wind scratched gently at the stained glass windows, but inside was nothing but warmth, whispers, and wealth. Helen sat near the front, a folded catalog in her lap. She wore a charcoal wrap coat and simple pearl earrings, her white hair pinned neatly. Beside her, Sophie scrolled through the digital version of the catalog on her phone, occasionally nudging Helen's elbow when something caught her eye. The auction house was full, a curated crowd of collectors, brokers, and bidders who knew the game well. Up on the raised dais, the auctioneer stepped forward to a ripple of polite applause. "Our first lot of the day," he announced, tapping the podium lightly, "is a vintage sapphire and diamond necklace set in 18-karat white gold, catalog item 204, a rare find with impeccable craftsmanship." A spotlight illuminated the necklace, now displayed on a velvet stand. It sparkled like ice in sunlight, restrained, elegant, lethal beauty. Helen leaned slightly toward Sophie. "That one," she murmured. "Melissa wore it to a New Year's Eve party in Atlanta. Told me." "I couldn't possibly understand," Sophie snorted softly. "She's right. You understand legacy piece?" The bidding began at $5,000, then $6,500, then $8,000. The numbers climbed, faster than Helen expected. A man in a tailored suit nodded quietly from the third row. A woman with red lips raised her paddle from the back. 11,000, the auctioneer called. "Do I have 12? Helen watched, calm and composed, as if she were simply observing a painting being sold. Her heart didn't race. It pulsed evenly, centered in a kind of stillness she hadn't known she'd been missing. 145. Going once, going twice. The gavel struck. Wood. A clean, definitive sound. Sold. Applause, modest and restrained as the auction continued. Piece after piece crossed the block, each one selling for more than the last. The tennis bracelet went for $18,200. The gold cuff fetched nearly $24,000. Even the brooch Melissa used to call tu matron drew heated interest and sold to a bidder in London for more than Helen expected to net from the entire collection. With each fall of the gavel, something loosened in her chest. Not vengeance exactly, but something adjacent to justice. As though every insult, every rolled eye, every dismissive laugh over the years had been spun into gold. Sophie leaned over and whispered, "Every insult polished the price." Helen smiled without turning her head. "Exactly." Halfway through the sale, a disturbance stirred at the back of the hall. It began as a murmur. Nothing disruptive, just the subtle shifting of bodies. Then the doors flung open with a crack. Melissa. Her heels echoed like gunshots on the tile as she marched down the aisle, eyes locked on the display screen showing the next piece, her diamond drop earrings, now lot 217. "What the hell is going on?" she shouted. Conversation stopped, heads turned. The auctioneer froze mid-sentence. "That's my jewelry," Melissa barked. "I didn't authorize this. Someone stop the sale." People began whispering in confused clusters, glancing between the stage and the furious woman storming the aisle. From her seat, Helen didn't move. She crossed one leg over the other and folded her hands calmly. A pair of security guards approached Melissa from both sides. She backed away instinctively, holding up her hands. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded. "Yes, ma'am," one of the guards said quietly. "And you've been asked to leave." "You can't sell this. This is theft," she screamed, trying to push past them. Helen finally turned her head and locked eyes with her daughter from across the room. Melissa stopped struggling, frozen in place. Helen didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The guards escorted Melissa out through the side doors, her voice still echoing faintly behind them as the heavy doors shut with a muffled thud. Silence returned. The auctioneer cleared his throat, glanced at Helen, then continued with professional composure. "Lot 217. We begin at $12,000. When the final piece sold, Helen remained seated until the crowd began to thin. Sophie squeezed her hand. "You okay?" she asked. Helen nodded. "Better than okay." A well-dressed woman in a navy pantsuit approached them, carrying a discreet black envelope. "Mrs. Wright," she said, her voice polite but warm. "Here are the final documents. Your total net proceeds after fees and commissions, $312,000. Helen took the envelope and glanced inside. The check sat crisp and clean against the paperwork. "Thank you," she said simply. The bank teller barely glanced at the amount before smiling politely and sliding the check under the glass to her manager. Helen stood patiently, her gloved hands resting on the marble counter, purse tucked beneath her arm. She wasn't jittery or breathless, just composed, grounded. The bank manager returned a few minutes later with a formal nod. "Mrs. Wright, the funds have been deposited into your account. It may take a few hours for the full balance to reflect online, but everything is settled." Helen gave a gentle smile. "I'm in no rush." She walked out beneath Charleston's gray December sky, her boots clicking steadily across the pavement. Rain had touched the streets earlier, darkening the cobblestone, but the air now held only the scent of earth and cold iron. A breeze tugged at the edges of her coat, but she didn't tighten it. She wasn't cold. Inside her bag was a deposit receipt for $312,000. By that afternoon, the rumor had already begun to spread. It started with a phone call to a friend, then a friend's friend, then the women Melissa met for Sunday brunch at the yacht club. "She stole it," Melissa hissed over speakerphone. "My mother stole my jewelry and sold it like she was flipping. A lawn chair at a yard sale." When one of the women politely asked if the jewelry had even been in Helen's name, Melissa snapped, "That's not the point. It was mine. I wore it. That old woman just wants revenge." Sophie, overhearing the call from the kitchen, didn't interrupt. She just walked into the garage, got in her car, and drove to Helen. She didn't even knock, just let herself in, the way she always had growing up. Helen was in the kitchen peeling apples for a pie. Pearl the cat dozed beside the radiator. Sophie leaned against the counter. Mom's playing victim on speakerphone now. Helen didn't look up. "Let her." Sophie tilted her head. "You're not worried she'll push it further?" "She will," Helen said simply, "but she's chasing wind." By evening, Melissa had gone further. She filed a police report, called it grand larceny, claimed her mother had stolen property worth over $4 million, and auctioned it off without consent. Detective Rowley from Charleston PD called Helen the next morning. Polite but perfunctory, he said, "We reviewed the consignment records. the appraisals, and the safe custody details. "Ma'am, it's a civil matter, not criminal. Nothing more to investigate on our end." Helen thanked him and hung up. She made no calls, no press statement. She didn't need to. The rumors kept multiplying, mostly thanks to Melissa. Whispers in grocery store aisles, social media captions drenched in innuendo. One post showed Melissa holding a cocktail in a dimly lit bar with the caption, "Imagine raising someone who bites the hand that dressed her." Helen ignored it, but Sophie didn't. She texted David Clean that evening, "Mom saying Grandma's a thief publicly. You might want to be ready." The next morning, David's reply came like clockwork. He was already drafting the response. "Let her walk into court with gossip. I'll bring the law." By Thursday, Helen met Arlene for breakfast at a quiet cafe just off Broad Street. The tables were half filled with locals in sweaters and scarves, and soft jazz hummed from speakers overhead. Arlene stirred her coffee slowly, her fingers adorned with rings that glinted faintly in the light. "How's it feel? Money in the bank? Peace in your bones?" Helen looked out the window, her eyes following a man walking his dog across the wet pavement. "It doesn't feel like revenge," she said. "It feels like balance." Arlene smiled. Nothing sweeter than interest earned on disrespect. They clinked mugs, and Helen laughed softly, the sound warm but edged with something older, something earned. Back at Melissa's house, Tyler stood in the kitchen staring at his phone as yet another alert popped up. A Charleston gossip forum had picked up the story. Anonymous users were speculating about Melissa's claims. A few even posted screenshots from Sophie's quietly circulating video. Melissa, screaming, wild-eyed, holding an empty cake. "Are you proud of this?" Melissa hissed from across the room, pacing. Tyler didn't answer. He couldn't. He just kept scrolling. His shoulders slumped further with each new comment. The summons arrived on a cold Monday morning, slipped under Helen's front door like an unwelcome draft. Pale ivory paper, crisp edges, and a stamped court seal that looked more theatrical than threatening. But Helen read every word carefully, her reading glasses resting low on her nose as she stood by the window, with the Charleston rain whispering against the glass. Melissa Wright versus Helen Wright. Claim: wrongful possession and sale of personal property. Value: $312,000 plus damages. Helen let out a slow breath. Not frustration, not fear, just confirmation. It was always going to come to this. By Wednesday, she sat beside David Clean in a quiet wood-paneled courtroom. The scent of old carpet and polished oak filled the air. Judge Alvarez presided from the bench, an older woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a sharp bun, black-framed glasses perched halfway down her nose, and an expression like she'd heard every lie twice already that day. Melissa sat at the plaintiff's table, draped in navy silk and righteous indignation. Her lips were painted darker than usual, her hair perfectly blown out. The performance had begun. "She stole from me," Melissa told the court, her voice steady. Clipped. "The jewelry was mine. My mother had no right to sell it." David rose calmly, unbothered. "Your Honor, the pieces in question were held in a safe located in Mrs. Wright's private residence. They were appraised under her name. She held them uncontested for over 10 years. No claim of ownership was ever filed by Ms. Wright." Melissa's face tightened. "I didn't think I had to file paperwork to own what's mine." Alvarez held up a hand. "You're not a lawyer, Ms. Wright. Let your attorney speak if you have one." Melissa glanced sideways. She didn't. She hadn't thought she'd need one. The confidence that had once fueled her social media presence now flickered unsure in the stark lighting of courtroom reality. David continued, "We also have video evidence showing Ms. Wright, Melissa, discarding her mother's personal belongings without consent in a manner both cruel and deliberately humiliating." He nodded to Sophie, seated behind them. She stood and walked calmly to the front, handing the court clerk a flash drive. The screen lit up. There it was. Melissa, caught in full color, screaming, red-faced, holding the empty case like it had personally betrayed her, and most damningly, video from 2 weeks prior. Melissa tossing Helen's carefully folded clothes into trash bags on the curb, muttering, "She looks like a corpse in half this stuff. I'm doing her a favor." The courtroom was silent. Judge Alvarez watched the video without blinking. Then she turned to Melissa. "Is that you?" Melissa squirmed. "It's taken out of context." "That's always the line," the judge muttered, unimpressed. "Here's what I see. Your mother possessed these items. She held the appraisal. The sale was legal. And the only theft I'm seeing is dignity, Ms. Wright, the kind you stripped from her without hesitation." Tyler sat a few rows back, shoulders hunched, eyes locked on the floor. He hadn't spoken all morning, hadn't even offered Melissa his hand when she brushed past him, walking into the courthouse. Now, as the weight of her public unraveling settled into the room, he seemed even smaller, like a shadow of himself, embarrassed by what he'd enabled. Helen didn't look at Melissa once. She sat upright, calm, composed, her pearl earrings glinting softly beneath the fluorescent lights, hands folded in her lap. Melissa tried again, voice trembling now. "She sold my life out from under me." "No," Alvarez said with finality. "She reclaimed hers." The hearing ended with a procedural continuance. No judgment yet, just deadlines for final filings, disclosures, and a trial date to be confirmed. But everyone in the room already knew how this was going to end. Outside the courthouse, Helen paused at the top of the stone steps. Sophie caught, up beside her, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. "She didn't see it coming," Sophie said. Helen shook her head. She never saw anything that wasn't gold-plated. The trial convened on a gray December morning, the kind where everything felt hushed under cloud cover. Inside courtroom 3B, fluorescent lights hummed quietly above polished wood and tension-filled rows of stiff-backed chairs. The room was fuller than last time. An assistant DA, 2 legal clerks, a courthouse reporter, and a handful of curious locals seated in the back row, half whispering over takeout coffee. Helen sat at the defense table, posture straight, glasses perched on. The bridge of her nose. David Clean organized their notes in front of him, legal pads stacked neatly, face unreadable. Across the aisle, Melissa sat beside a junior attorney she'd finally hired, probably after being told the stakes were bigger than her ego could manage alone. She wore a black suit that felt too sharp, too dramatic. Her hair was pinned high, exposing the full severity of her expression. She glanced around the room like she was scanning for paparazzi, as if someone might still frame her in a flattering light. Judge Alvarez entered briskly and took her seat without ceremony. "We're here to begin formal trial proceedings in Wright versus," she said, flipping through the preliminary notes. "Plaintiff, you may call your first witness." Melissa stood before her attorney could move. "I'll testify," she said. "I want the court to hear from me." Her lawyer looked surprised, but sat back anyway. Melissa walked to the witness stand like she was walking a runway, head high, each step practiced, sworn in, seated, and suddenly softer. She leaned slightly forward as if offering the room a secret. "They were mine," she said, voice carefully modulated. "Those pieces were given to me by my ex-husband, by my late grandfather, by friends. My mother was only holding them temporarily. She knew that." David stood. "Permission to question the witness, Your Honor?" Alvarez gave a curt nod. David approached. The stand slowly, calm but precise. "Miss Wright, are you aware that all appraisals for these items were filed under your mother's name? She told me that was just for safekeeping. Do you have written proof of that agreement?" Melissa hesitated. "No, we didn't use a contract." "Do you have any record of having insured the jewelry in your name? Any documentation tying your ownership to those pieces?" "No." David raised a single sheet of paper. Do you recognize this? Melissa squinted. That's one of the appraisals. Correct, David said. Dated 2013, registered under Helen Wright, valued at $17,800. Nowhere on. This or any document is your name listed as owner or co-owner. Melissa opened her mouth, but he continued before she could speak. We also have screenshots, he said, gesturing to the screen behind the witness stand. Sophie stepped forward and handed a flash drive to the clerk. The monitor came to life. Posts from Melissa's public social media account filled the screen. Her wearing the sapphire necklace at a gala, captioned, "Wearing this feels like carrying the weight of royalty." Another showed the diamond earrings with the words, "Worth more than my mom's entire closet combined." The room was silent, save for the buzz of the projector. David turned toward the judge. These were posted in the last 2 years. By her own words, she equates ownership with superiority. There's no mention of temporary safekeeping, only pride, only possession. Alvarez leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Melissa. You called these things an extension of your identity, Miss Wright, but nothing in writing supports that you ever owned them. Melissa flushed. I didn't think I had to put a claim on my own life. David turned back to the judge. She discarded her mother's belongings like trash and now claims the very items she left behind are priceless heirlooms. The law isn't built on selective memory. It's built on record, and the record is clear. Helen hadn't said a word, but now she rose at David's subtle nod and approached the witness stand slowly. She didn't look at Melissa. She addressed the judge directly. She wanted me in rags, Helen said, her voice low but firm. She wanted to erase me with garbage bags and silence, so I wrapped her greed in receipts. That's the only language she's ever respected. Melissa started to say something, but Judge Alvarez held up a hand. Miss Wright, she said, turning to Melissa, you may be seated. Melissa's mouth snapped shut. Alvarez paused, her tone suddenly still. Let me be very clear. If you disrupt these proceedings again with emotional outbursts, you'll be held in contempt. You are not here to play a victim. You are here to provide evidence. So far, you've provided none. The silence that followed stretched tight. We'll reconvene next Friday for closing arguments, Alvarez announced. Until then, both parties are instructed not to discuss this trial publicly. Understood? Both sides nodded. Melissa sat stone-faced. Helen didn't look at her once. The notice came via certified mail. Thick envelope, legal letterhead, the kind of delivery that landed like a slap. Helen opened it on her porch with Pearl curled at her feet, Charleston's early winter sun stretching thin across the stoop. She read the first sentence twice. Melissa Wright petitions for temporary and permanent guardianship over Helen Wright, citing cognitive decline and impaired judgment. Helen stared at the page for a moment, then folded it slowly, deliberately, and placed it back in the envelope like she might a wasp's nest, careful not to crush it, but knowing full well it would still sting. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. It didn't surprise her. Melissa had always operated on one principle. If she couldn't win with facts, she'd try perception. David was furious when she brought it to his office. She's attempting a reverse power play, he said, flipping through the pages. She knows she's losing the civil suit, so she's trying to cast you as unstable to delegitimize everything. Helen poured herself a small cup of water from the cooler. Let her try. David looked at her over his glasses. We'll need a full medical workup. I want this crushed so thoroughly it can't be recycled. Helen nodded. Already booked. 2 days later, she sat under the hum of bright lights in Dr. Renaer's office, answering a series of cognitive questions with the same patience she'd once used to untangle thread knots from sewing machines. Name, address, president. Count backward. From 100 by sevens, she passed with flying colors. The doctor, a sharp-witted woman in her 50s, signed the cognitive competency certification herself. I don't know who thought this was a good idea, Dr. Renaer said, but whoever they are, They clearly haven't spoken to you for more than 5 minutes. Helen smiled. Unfortunately, they've spoken to me for years. That's the problem. By the time the courtroom doors opened for the guardianship hearing, word had gotten around. Local legal aides had taken an interest. Helen's friends from the Sewing Guild came. Even Judge Alvarez's clerk seemed more alert than usual. Melissa sat at the petitioner's table, flanked by the same junior attorney, her expression pinched with manufactured concern. Your Honor, the lawyer began. Our client believes that Mrs. Wright is exhibiting signs of early-stage cognitive decline given the complexity of financial decisions currently at stake. Guardianship would ensure her safety and prevent any further questionable asset management. Helen sat quietly beside David, her gray coat folded over her lap. She said nothing. Alvarez nodded. You have supporting medical records? The lawyer cleared his throat. Not directly, no, but Ms. Wright has observed behavioral patterns, erratic choices, uncharacteristic impulsiveness. David stood calm as ever. We have a notarized letter from Helen Wright's physician confirming she's in excellent physical and cognitive health. Additionally, she completed a full neurocognitive evaluation this week and passed with scores well above the national average for her age. He handed the documents to the clerk, who walked them to the judge. Sophie stepped forward. From the gallery, raising a hand, Alvarez squinted. Are you requesting to speak? Yes, Your Honor. David gave her a quick, approving nod. Sophie approached the podium with unshakable poise. I live with my grandmother. I've watched her manage bills, organize legal documents, cook 3 meals a day, and sew a quilt in the same week. She's sharper than anyone in this courtroom, including me. Melissa stiffened, but Sophie didn't flinch. And this petition, Sophie added, it's a lie, an ugly, desperate lie. Judge Alvarez took a long breath. Her fingers drummed once on the bench. This petition, she said, is not only unsubstantiated, it is offensive. It's an abuse of the legal system, a stunt. I've seen more evidence of cognitive impairment in your social media rants, Ms. Wright, than in anything about your mother's behavior. Melissa's cheeks flushed deep red. Petition denied, Alvarez snapped, and I'm entering a warning on record. Any further attempt to weaponize the guardianship system will be grounds for sanction. You are dismissed. Melissa stormed out before the gavel even dropped. Outside the courthouse, David handed Helen her coat and walked beside her in silence until they reached the curb. Then he stopped, flipping through an email on his phone. Funny thing, he murmured. Helen turned to him. I started looking into Melissa's financials this week. Public records, debt disclosure, lien filing. Helen's brow lifted slightly, and David held up his phone. 3 months ago, she took out a second mortgage on her house, quietly filed under her name only. It paid off 2 luxury credit cards and, get this, made a large payment to a private jeweler specializing in high-end replicas. Helen blinked. You mean she borrowed against her house? David said, to buy fakes so no one would know the originals. We're gone. Tyler stood in the doorway of the guest bedroom like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His shirt was wrinkled, his collar unbuttoned, and his hands hung uselessly at his sides. Across the room, Helen sat in the armchair by the window, a legal pad in her lap, but she hadn't written anything for a while. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen didn't look up. I assumed you would eventually. Tyler stepped in, closing the door behind him with the soft click of guilt. She mortgaged the house, he said, behind my back. Took out almost $200,000, said it was to cover investments. Helen turned to face him now, quiet and steady. It wasn't investments, he continued. She bought fake jewelry, high-end replicas, thousands of dollars worth. I only found out last week when the first foreclosure notice showed up in the mail. Helen's gaze didn't waver. To protect her image, he nodded, to keep up appearances while the real pieces were missing. She figured if no one noticed the difference, the lie would hold. There was a pause. Then Helen leaned forward, folding her hands carefully. "She threw away my clothes," she said, "and she pawned her walls." Tyler exhaled sharply, like the truth itself had weight. "I tried to talk to her. She wouldn't listen. Kept saying everything would work out once the trial was over." Helen stood. Her movements were deliberate, elegant even now. "You stayed quiet through everything she did to me. But silence has a cost too, Tyler." "I know," he said, swallowing hard. "That's why I'm telling you now." Downstairs, Sophie sat, curled on the living room sofa, arms wrapped around Grace, Melissa's youngest niece, 11 years old, tear-streaked and clutching a blanket. She wasn't supposed to be visiting this weekend, but Melissa had begged Helen to take her just for a few days while she handled a few things. Grace had overheard the shouting, had seen the envelope on the kitchen counter, half open, the word foreclosure printed in red across the top. She said, "We might have to move," Grace whispered, but she didn't say why. Sophie brushed the girl's hair back gently. "It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." "She's always yelling now," Grace said, her voice breaking. "Even when I just ask, 'What's for dinner?'" Sophie pulled her closer. "Sometimes people who are falling apart try to pretend they're in control by hurting everyone around them." Helen entered the room and knelt beside them, resting a hand on Grace's knee. "You're safe here, sweetheart," she said. "And the truth, however hard, is always better than the lies we tell to keep our crown straight." That afternoon, Arlene came by with soup and sharp commentary. She set the pot on the stove and took one look at Tyler, who was still nursing black coffee at the kitchen counter, and shook her head. "You know," she said, "rot is like fruit rot. It always starts shiny until the flies show up." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Rot spreads quick, especially when it's wrapped in gold foil," Arlene added. They both fell quiet as the kettle began to hiss, a slow, steady pressure building like everything else. The next morning in court, Judge Alvarez opened with a single sentence. "I've reviewed the foreclosure notice." Melissa looked like she hadn't slept. Her makeup was heavier, her suit tighter. She sat rigid, as if her spine were trying to hold together what her pride no longer could. "I'm ordering a full financial disclosure," Alvarez continued. "Bank records, mortgage documentation, and all recent credit expenditures. You have 72 hours to comply." Melissa shifted in her seat. Her new attorney whispered something into her ear, but she didn't react. Alvarez leaned forward. "You've dragged this courtroom through emotional spectacle, and now it appears you've misled this court by omission." David stood, calm and measured. "We'll provide all requested documents, Your Honor." Sophie glanced at Melissa, whose fingers were trembling just slightly against the table. Outside, the wind had picked up, Charleston's trees bending under it like they knew something was coming. The courtroom was fuller than usual. Word had spread through whispers, through Charleston's gossip circles, and through those little sideways glances that carried more curiosity than sympathy. By the time Judge Alvarez entered, half the gallery was occupied with locals pretending to check their phones while watching it all unfold. Helen sat upright, her coat folded neatly over her lap, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Sophie sat beside her, legs crossed, hair tucked behind one ear, eyes sharp as ever. David Clean, calm as a stone, organized their exhibits for the final time. Across the aisle, Melissa sat rigid in a navy sheath dress, her face a stiff, manufactured calm, barely masking the crack beneath. Her new attorney sat beside her, flipping through papers like he already knew what was coming. Judge Alvarez wasted no time. "I've reviewed all final documentation," she said, her voice filling the room without needing volume. "I've reviewed appraisals, the timeline of possession, the consignment agreement, and the plaintiff's financial disclosures, including, regrettably, documents that were initially withheld." Melissa blinked, her fingers digging into the padded edge of the table. "I find no legal basis for Melissa Wright's claim of ownership. The jewelry was held for more than a decade in Helen Wright's possession. All appraisals list her as the owner. She had the legal and moral authority to sell the property. The sale stands. A murmur rippled through the back rows. Sophie didn't smile. She just inhaled deeply, like the room had finally given her permission to breathe. Judge Alvarez turned toward Melissa. Additionally, Miss Wright, you filed a police report citing theft, initiated a baseless guardianship petition, and delayed this court with incomplete disclosures, all of which wasted considerable resources. I am fining you $15,000 for false filings and procedural obstruction. The color drained from Melissa's face. Her mouth twitched like she was about to say something, then shut again. Tyler sat one row behind her, his shoulders hunched, his wedding ring loose on his finger. He leaned forward slightly, then hesitated, then stood slowly and crossed to Helen's side of the courtroom. As the gallery stirred, he leaned down, voice low. I should have said something sooner, he murmured. I'm sorry, Helen. She looked at him long and clear. For what it's worth, he added, you raised a better daughter than I married. She gave him a single nod. Nothing more, nothing less. Melissa watched it unfold like someone watching their own life through a glass wall. Present but powerless. Then it broke. You ruined me, she screamed. The courtroom froze. Her voice cracked on the word ruined, as though the weight of it couldn't sustain its own structure. You're all against me, she shouted, standing now, hands trembling. I'm not the villain here. She is. She stole from me. She made me look like... Judge Alvarez didn't flinch. No, she said calmly, voice like iron. You did that yourself. Melissa's lips parted again, but no words came. Only silence, thick, complete, irreversible. She sank back into her chair, mascara smudging at the corners of her eyes. Her attorney whispered something urgent, but she didn't seem to hear it. Alvarez stacked her notes and rose. Court is adjourned. The gavel dropped once, and just like that, it was over. Outside, sunlight had broken through the clouds for the first time in days. Helen stepped onto the courthouse steps with Sophie beside her, the warmth catching the side of her face as if the sky had waited just for this moment. Sophie turned to her. You won. Helen exhaled slowly. I didn't win, she said. I survived. Sophie wrapped her arms around her tightly. You did both. They stood there for a long moment, the city moving quietly around them. Behind them, Tyler lingered just inside the doors. Melissa remained seated, unmoving. She stared at the tabletop, like it might crack open and swallow her whole. It was just past 9 a.m. when the sheriff's cruiser pulled into the cul-de-sac, quiet, deliberate, with the kind of presence that didn't need a siren. The door opened, boots struck concrete, and within seconds, the man in uniform was walking up the brick path to Melissa Wright's front door, an envelope in one hand, a strip of orange tape in the other. The foreclosure notice went up fast, official, unmistakable, slapped across the dark-stained wood like a sentence already served. Neighbors watched through blinds. A few stood outside clutching mugs, pretending to check the weather while stealing long glances toward the chaos unfolding at number 12. They didn't speak loudly, just exchanged pointed looks. One woman leaned toward another and whispered, Karma doesn't knock. Melissa opened the door seconds later, her face sleep-swollen and unevenly powdered. Her eyes dropped to the notice, then lifted to the sheriff's face. You can't be serious, she said. He didn't flinch. 30 days. The bank owns it now. She didn't scream. Not this time. Instead, she slumped against the doorframe like her bones had suddenly hollowed out. The sheriff turned and left without ceremony, and the cruiser rolled off down the street like it had never been there at all. Melissa stood there for a moment longer, then stepped barefoot onto the front steps, gripping a styrofoam coffee cup from some gas station down the road, the kind that caved slightly if you held it too tight. And she cried. Not loud, not theatrical, just small, broken sobs that made no demands, no audience. Her makeup began to run in streaks, dark lines down a pale face that once spent more on contour than groceries. Helen passed by 20 minutes later. Behind the wheel of Sophie's old car, now hers again, after they had updated the title together at the DMV. She didn't slow. She didn't stop. She didn't even blink as she turned onto the street and passed the house with the notice. The woman on the steps, the wreckage in real time. But Sophie in the passenger seat turned to look. Her mother looked smaller than ever. Not fragile, just deflated, like something had left her. Something essential. Pride, maybe, denial, or simply the illusion that any of it had ever been under her control. She still thinks someone else did this to her, Sophie said quietly. Helen didn't answer. The light turned green. That evening, Sophie carried 2 duffel bags up the front steps of Helen's townhouse. No drama, no announcement, just the decision. Quiet and final, to leave the house where mirrors mattered more than memory. She set the bags down in the guest room, then wandered into the kitchen where Helen was peeling carrots over the sink, jazz humming low on the radio. I can take the pull-out in the den if you want your sewing table left alone, Sophie offered. Helen didn't turn. Guest room's made up, and I'd rather have you here than a quilt I haven't finished in years. They exchanged a glance. No sentimentality, just agreement. Sophie poured herself a glass of water. You think she'll actually leave when the date comes? Helen peeled slowly. People who build their lives on veneers usually wait until the last coat chips. There was a knock at the back door. Arlene let herself in without waiting. Brought lemon bars, she said, dropping her purse on the table. And an update. Just drove past the foreclosure palace. Helen raised an eyebrow. She's got cardboard boxes stacked on the porch like a Pottery Barn clearance aisle, crying into a styrofoam cup like she's auditioning for a sympathy scholarship. Sophie smirked. Arlene pulled a porcelain teacup from the cabinet, filled it with water, and took a slow sip before speaking again. Porcelain beats styrofoam every time, she said. It doesn't leak, doesn't melt, and when it breaks, it shatters. Clean. Helen set the carrot down and nodded once. She chose the cheap shine. Now she's drinking from it. Outside, the December wind picked up again, brushing leaves across the porch in long, scraping gusts. It was the second time in 2 months Melissa Wright stood trial, and this time there were no inheritance claims, no family squabbles to dress in legal ease. This was state criminal mortgage fraud, wire fraud, falsified financial disclosures. The charges hit like a drumbeat when the prosecutor read them aloud in the hushed courtroom. Melissa sat expressionless beside her public defender. The once sculpted mask of her face, now slack, worn down by the weight of weeks with no mirrors that lied. The state's evidence was straightforward and brutal: a falsified income statement, forged tax returns. A luxury jeweler flagged for issuing a $72,000 invoice paid from mortgage funds labeled renovation. Your Honor, the prosecutor said as the jury watched, this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate deceit by someone desperate to keep up appearances, while the walls crumbled behind her. Tyler was called first. He looked like a man unraveling quietly, a thread at a time. His blazer didn't fit right, and he kept fidgeting with the sleeves. When sworn in, he avoided everyone's eyes, including his wife's. Did you know she had taken out a second mortgage? The prosecutor asked. No, Tyler said. Not until the notice came in the mail. Did she ever tell you why she needed that money? Tyler swallowed. She said it was investments. And then she told me it was so people wouldn't think we were struggling, that it was temporary, that it would pay off. Did she admit the jewelry was fake? Tyler hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he said. As long as it looked real, nobody would care. Melissa sat rigid, her fingers tied around the arms of her chair. Next came Sophie. She walked up to the witness stand like it was a hallway she'd walked all her life, confident, purposeful, unafraid. The prosecutor introduced screenshots from Melissa's phone, text messages recovered from a cloud backup Sophie had flagged after finding the synced account on an old tablet. One text read, "It's not about the jewelry, it's about power. She thinks she's won, but the house still looks good. That's what people remember." Another, "I'd burn this place down before I let her look better than me." Sophie didn't add commentary. She let the texts speak. When asked to summarize her understanding, she simply said she knew, and she didn't care who it hurt. Then Helen was called. She stood slowly, adjusted her glasses, and took the stand like a woman walking across a bridge she'd already burned quietly and without regret. "Mrs. Wright," the prosecutor asked, "did you have any part in the mortgage or its execution?" "No," Helen replied. "I only learned about it when the house was already being taken." "Did you feel responsible for the fallout?" Helen looked toward Melissa, who didn't meet her eyes. Then she answered, "No, I felt responsible for what I did, which was survive her." There was no objection, just silence. Closing arguments came quickly. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with folded paper in hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." Melissa didn't cry. Not at first. She sat stunned, as if conviction spoken plainly. Publicly, officially, was too far from her carefully curated life to register as real. But when the judge read the sentence, 18 months suspended, 6 months of supervised home confinement, and a lifetime ban from financial services, something cracked. Her shoulders shuddered, her hands went to her mouth, and then she folded right there in the chair as if gravity had grown crueler in an instant. No one moved to comfort her. Outside the courthouse, Sophie leaned against the hood of Helen's car, arms folded against the breeze. "She'll never admit any of this was her fault," she said. "She doesn't have to," Helen replied. "The ledgers balance." Sophie looked over. So what now? Helen pulled a folded deed from her purse and handed it over. The bank's logo was stamped in the upper corner. Sophie opened it slowly, reading the top line aloud. "Title transfer 12 Hawthorne Place. New owner Helen Morson Bright. Paid in full." "You bought the house?" Sophie blinked. "With the auction money." Helen smiled faintly. "It was already empty. I just made sure it stayed that way." A gust of wind tugged at the hem of her coat as the courthouse doors opened again behind them. And Melissa stepped out, her steps unsteady, her gaze low. She didn't look toward them, not once. It was held in a cramped municipal annex just off Broad Street. No chandeliers, no velvet ropes, just folding chairs, fluorescent lighting, and a podium that wobbled slightly whenever the auctioneer adjusted his mic. The crowd was sparse. A few regular investors, one local flipper, 2 board reporters with press badges clipped to their lanyards, and Helen Wright seated near the front. She wore the same wrap coat she'd worn to Melissa's trial, her hands gloved and still. Beside her sat Sophie, hair pulled back, legal pad in her lap, but nothing written on it. She didn't need notes for this. Up front, the auctioneer cleared, his throat and read from the printed sheet. Item 7, 12 Hawthorne Place. Starting bid $275,000. Court approved foreclosure. There was a quiet shifting of seats. A man in a leather jacket raised his paddle. $275, the auctioneer announced. Helen raised her hand. $280. The leather jacket hesitated. His realtor leaned in, whispered something. He nodded. $285. Helen's hand again. $290. Then silence. The auctioneer scanned the room. $290, going once, going twice. Sold, he said, striking the podium to bidder number 104. Helen didn't smile. She just lowered her hand, folded it into her lap, and exhaled softly. Behind her, 2 neighbors who recognized her from Sunday church exchanged stunned glances. "Wasn't that her daughter's place?" one whispered. "It is now," the other replied. Outside, the air had warmed slightly. Charleston's winter sun filtered through the live oaks like it had forgotten what month it was. Helen and Sophie walked out quietly, their heels ticking softly against the sidewalk. "Do you feel different?" Sophie asked. Helen took a long breath, watching a leaf tumble across the courthouse steps. "I feel clean." Sophie unzipped her jacket slightly. "You now legally own everything she burned down." "No," Helen corrected, her voice gentle but firm. "I own peace. She owns consequences." They crossed the street as a city bus rumbled past. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed noon. Everything felt lighter, not triumphant, but settled. Back in the neighborhood, the news had already traveled. A woman on the HOA board posted the auction results in the group thread with the caption, "Bought by a family member. No renters, no drama." Another neighbor replied with a gift of slow applause. Tyler didn't respond because Tyler was gone. The day after Melissa's sentencing, his car disappeared from the driveway. His LinkedIn page went dark, his work voicemail rerouted to the general office line. Someone said he left for Savannah. Someone else said Key West. Sophie didn't care. Helen didn't ask. He always moved around when things got too loud. Sophie said once over coffee, like guilt couldn't catch him if he crossed a state line. Helen just stirred her cream in silence. That evening, Arlene arrived with a bottle of elderflower wine and a box of old photos she claimed she'd been meaning to organize for 15 years. When Helen told her about the auction win, Arlene's eyes gleamed. "From trash to titles," she said, raising her glass. "Only you could turn a curbside insult into property acquisition." Helen chuckled. "I didn't plan it, no." Arlene agreed, sipping. "But you didn't flinch either. That counts more." They sat in Helen's living room, surrounded by boxes of thread and books, while Sophie flipped through a real estate brochure Helen had left on the table. "You're keeping the house?" she asked. "I'm renovating it," Helen replied. "Something small, quiet, nothing flashy." Sophie looked up. "For who?" Helen didn't answer immediately. She just looked toward the window where the evening light stretched, across the hardwood like a ribbon. "Maybe for women who need a landing place," she said at last. "Ones who know what it feels like to be discarded and want to be whole again." Sophie set the brochure down. "That's not a house. That's redemption." Helen nodded. "Exactly." The dining room table hadn't seen this much light in years. Golden hour poured through the tall front windows, casting long slants of amber across polished wood and bone-white china. Helen moved gracefully between the kitchen and dining room, her hands never rushing, her expression composed but content. The table was modest but intentional. A roast chicken rested at the center, flanked by bowls of rosemary potatoes, lemoned green beans, and Arlene's corn pudding. A bottle of red wine breathed near the edge, and 3 porcelain plates sat perfectly spaced, glinting under the light of a chandelier Helen had cleaned herself earlier that morning. No paper napkins, no mismatched cutlery, no styrofoam in sight. Just real things. Arlene arrived first, draped in a velvet shawl she only wore on nights that meant something. She placed a jar of cranberry chutney beside the wine like it belonged there all along, then stepped back to admire the table. "Well," she said, eyebrows raised, "this beats any sympathy casserole I've ever seen." Sophie followed moments later, arms full with a fresh baguette wrapped in brown paper, and her hair still damp from the shower. She smelled of citrus and lilac, like someone who hadn't just left a house, but an era. "You didn't have to go all out," she said, dropping a kiss on Helen's cheek. "I didn't," Helen replied, adjusting a fork by half an inch. "I went just far." "Enough." Dinner began quietly, hands clasped, a soft grace spoken aloud by Arlene, with her usual humor baked into the final line. "And may every lie be as short-lived as a microwave biscuit." Laughter followed, not forced, not sharp, but open and earned. They ate slowly, savoring every flavor and pause. The house didn't echo anymore. It absorbed. At one point, Sophie leaned back in her chair, sipping from a stemmed glass. "You know," she said, "you could have sold the place. Let someone else deal with the memory." With her, Helen looked across the table, her voice calm. "She didn't stain the house, just the curtains." Arlene chuckled. "Well said." Later, as the dishes were cleared and the last light of the sun slanted low across the window ledges, Sophie and Arlene washed up while Helen stepped onto the back porch. The air was still and warm, rare for late December. Somewhere beyond the tall fence, a dog barked twice, then stopped. Helen rested both hands on the wooden railing and looked out, toward the horizon where the sun was folding itself into the water's edge. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Sophie joined her quietly, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "You've rebuilt something," she said, "and I'm not just talking about the house." Helen glanced at her. "Nice things aren't fabric. Or stone. They're respect, boundaries, peace, and real china," Sophie added, nudging her arm. Helen allowed herself the smallest grin. "That too." Inside, Arlene turned on a lamp and dimmed it just enough to keep the room cozy. The porch light flicked on with a soft buzz, and Helen could just barely make out the shape of the tree she'd planted when Sophie was born. Still small, still stubborn, but rooted deep. "I don't want to forget what happened," Sophie said after a moment. "You won't," Helen replied, "but you'll stop needing to explain it." A gust of wind passed through the trees, stirring a few dry leaves, then quiet again. They stood side by side, watching the sky shift from pink to deep violet. Sophie reached for her hand. "Thank you." "For what?" Helen asked. "For showing me what grace really looks like, and for not letting her break. You!" Helen's voice was almost a whisper. "She tried." Sophie nodded. "And you didn't break." Helen stared straight ahead, eyes reflecting the last streaks of sunset. "No," she said, "I didn't." She turned toward the house, the lights warm, the laughter from inside echoing faintly through the walls. And then the final line, spoken not to Sophie, not even to herself, but to the world she now lived in quietly and completely. "She threw away my clothes, I auctioned her greed, and I kept every last cent and my dignity.